On April 21, 1945, in the final days of World War II, a 15-year-old boy named Günter Halm did something that sounds like pure fiction. He stole a 30-ton Panther tank from the Nazi SS, climbed inside alone, fired up its 700-horsepower engine, and drove it straight into battle against the same forces that had built it. No training, no backup, no second chances. Just a teenage scout armed with nothing but desperate courage and a stolen war machine. This isn't a Hollywood script. This is the true story of how a child became a one-man resistance army in the dying heart of the Third Reich, and how history almost forgot his name. To understand how a boy could do the impossible, you need to understand the Germany he lived in during the spring of 1945. The war was lost. Everyone knew it. Soviet tanks were crushing through the east. American and British forces were flooding in from the west. German cities were reduced to smoking graveyards. The Nazi regime, once so confident in its 1,000-year empire, was now a cornered animal, lashing out at everyone, including its own people. In these final weeks, the SS, Hitler's elite paramilitary force, had become judge, jury, and executioner on German streets. They hung deserters from lampposts. They shot civilians suspected of defeatism. They turned German towns into war zones not to fight the Allies, but to punish their own countrymen for the crime of wanting to survive. Günter Halm was not a soldier. He was a kid from a small town, a member of the Hitler Youth like nearly every German boy his age, but his heart was never in the propaganda. While other boys dreamed of glory and medals, Günter saw the truth behind the flags and the speeches. He watched his neighbors disappear. He saw the fear in his mother's eyes. He understood that the men in black uniforms with skull insignias were not protectors but predators. By April of 1945, Günter's town was caught in the collapse. The front lines were everywhere and nowhere. Refugee columns clogged the roads. Bombers droned overhead day and night. And in the chaos, the SS had set up a command post right in the center of town, using it as a staging ground for their reign of terror. The SS didn't just occupy the town, they ruled it with absolute brutality. Anyone who suggested surrender was labeled a traitor. White flags were torn down and their owners executed on the spot. Günter watched as men he'd known his entire life, men who simply wanted the killing to stop, were dragged into the town square and hanged. Their bodies were left swinging as warnings. The message was clear. The war would continue until every last German was dead, and anyone who disagreed would die first. For most people, there was nothing to do but hide, pray, and wait for the inevitable. But Günter Halm was not most people. Somewhere in that 15-year-old mind, a decision crystallized. He couldn't stop the war, he couldn't save everyone, but maybe, just maybe, he could stop the monsters in his own backyard. And then, on the outskirts of town, he saw it. A Panther tank, one of Germany's most feared weapons, a steel fortress on tracks equipped with a 75mm cannon that could punch through almost any Allied armor. It had been abandoned or parked by a crew that had fled or died. It sat there dormant, a sleeping dragon in the middle of the apocalypse. For most people, it was just another piece of wreckage in a landscape of ruin. For Günter, it was an opportunity. He had no idea how to drive a tank. He had no idea if the engine even worked. He had no idea if he'd survive the next 5 minutes. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. If he could get that monster running, he could make the SS pay. That's where our story truly begins. Not with a trained soldier, not with a seasoned resistance fighter, but with a 15-year-old boy standing in front of a 30-ton war machine, about to do something that would either save his town or get him killed in the most spectacular way imaginable. What happened next would become one of the most incredible and forgotten acts of defiance in the final days of Nazi Germany. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why Günter Halm's name deserves to be remembered alongside the greatest heroes of World War II. Before Günter Halm could become the boy who stole a tank, he had to survive growing up in a country that devoured its own children. He was born in 1929, which meant his entire childhood unfolded under the shadow of the swastika. By the time he was old enough to understand the world, Hitler was already in power, and Germany was being reshaped into a war machine. Every boy his age was automatically enrolled in the Hitler Youth, the Nazi organization designed to turn children into fanatics. They wore uniforms. They marched in formation. They sang songs about blood and soil and dying for the fatherland. But while most boys absorbed the propaganda like sponges, Günter had something that saved him. A father who whispered the truth when no one else was listening. His father had fought in the First World War, had seen the real cost of nationalism and blind obedience, and he made sure his son understood that the uniforms and flags were just decorations on a machine built to kill. Günter learned to play the part, to salute and march and mouth the words, but inside he remained his own person. That quiet resistance, cultivated over years, would be the foundation of everything that came next. By April of 1945, Günter's hometown had become a snapshot of Germany's total collapse. The town sat in the path of the advancing American forces, which meant it was both a target and a prize. The Wehrmacht, Germany's regular army, had mostly disintegrated. The soldiers who remained were either too old, too young, or too wounded to be effective. But the SS was different. They weren't interested in military strategy or tactical retreats. They were ideological enforcers, true believers in Hitler's apocalyptic vision, and they saw surrender as the ultimate betrayal. So they dug in, they set up machine gun nests, they fortified buildings. And most importantly, they made it clear that anyone who tried to welcome the Americans with white flags would be shot. The town was trapped between two armies, the Americans who were coming to liberate it, and the SS who were determined to burn it down rather than let it fall intact. Günter watched this insanity unfold from his family's home, and with each passing day, the tension grew unbearable. The breaking point came when the SS commander, an officer whose name has been lost to history but whose cruelty has not, ordered the execution of 3 local men. Their crime was simple. They had been overheard discussing surrender. They weren't resistance fighters, they weren't spies, they were a shopkeeper, a teacher and a farmer, men with families, men who just wanted the killing to stop. The SS dragged them to the town square in broad daylight, forced them to their knees, and shot them in the backs of their heads while the entire town watched. Then the bodies were left there, sprawled in the dirt, as a lesson. Günter was in the crowd that day. He was 15 years old and he watched 3 men he knew get murdered for the crime of wanting peace. That image, those bodies, that blood soaking into the cobblestones of his hometown, that was the moment something broke inside him. Not broke in the sense of shattering, but broke free. He realized that waiting for the Americans to arrive might take days, and in those days, the SS would kill more people. His neighbors, his friends, maybe even his family. That night, Günter couldn't sleep. He lay in his bed listening to the distant rumble of artillery, the sound of 2 armies moving closer, and he made a decision that no 15-year-old should ever have to make. He decided to act. He didn't have a gun. He didn't have allies. He didn't even have a plan, not really. But he had seen something earlier that day while moving through the outskirts of town, something that most people had walked past without a second glance. The Panther tank. It had been sitting there for at least 2 days, abandoned near a destroyed bridge. Maybe its crew had been killed. Maybe they'd fled. It didn't matter. What mattered was that it was there, unguarded, a weapon of unimaginable power, just waiting for someone brave enough or crazy enough to use it. Günter had never driven a car, let alone a tank. He had no idea if it even had fuel or ammunition. But he knew that if he could somehow get it running, he could drive it straight into the SS command post and end their reign of terror in one explosive moment. The next morning, April 21st, Günter told his mother he was going to check on a friend. It was a lie, but a necessary one. He didn't want her to know what he was planning because if she knew, she would stop him. And if she stopped him, more people would die. He walked through the destroyed streets of his town, past burned-out buildings and frightened faces, and he headed toward the outskirts where the Panther waited. Every step felt like walking toward his own execution. He had no illusions about his chances. If the tank didn't start, he'd just be a kid standing next to a useless hunk of metal. If it did start, but he couldn't figure out how to drive it, he'd probably crash and die. And if he actually managed to drive it into town and attack the SS, they would kill him without hesitation. But none of that mattered anymore. What mattered was that someone had to do something, and he was the only one crazy enough to try. When Günter reached the Panther tank, He stood in front of it for a long moment, trying to process the absurdity of what he was about to attempt. The machine was a monster. 45 feet long, nearly 10 feet tall, covered in sloped armor plates designed to deflect shells that would tear through buildings. Its main gun, the 75mm cannon, jutted out like the fang of some mechanical predator. This wasn't a tool. This was a weapon built for one purpose: to dominate the battlefield and destroy anything in its path. And here was Günter, a 15-year-old boy who weighed maybe 130 pounds, staring up at it like David facing Goliath. Except David had a sling and years of practice. Günter had nothing but desperation and a half-remembered conversation he'd overheard from Wehrmacht soldiers months earlier about how tank engines worked. He circled the vehicle slowly, checking for damage, looking for any obvious reason why it had been abandoned. There were no visible holes, no shattered treads, no sign of catastrophic failure. It looked intact, which meant there was a chance, however slim, that it might actually run. Climbing onto the Panther was harder than he expected. The hull was smooth and angled, designed to deflect shots, which also made it nearly impossible to grip. He scraped his knees and elbows, pulling himself up, finally managing to reach the commander's cupola on top of the turret. The hatch was unlocked, which was either incredible luck or a sign that the crew had abandoned it in a panic. He pulled it open, and the smell hit him immediately. Oil, gunpowder, sweat, and something else he couldn't identify, but made his stomach turn. The interior was cramped and dark, a maze of levers, pedals, gauges, and ammunition racks. Everything was labeled in German, which helped, but the labels assumed you already knew what you were doing. Günter dropped down into the driver's compartment, a tight space in the front of the hull where he could barely move. There was a seat, a steering mechanism that looked more like motorcycle handlebars than a steering wheel, and a bewildering array of instruments. He had no idea what most of them did. But he did know one thing. Tanks had ignition systems, and if he could find it, he might be able to start the engine. His hands were shaking as he searched the compartment. Sweat dripped into his eyes, even though the morning was cool. Every sound outside made him freeze, terrified that an SS patrol had spotted him. But the town was quiet, everyone hiding indoors, waiting for the inevitable battle. Finally, he found what he thought was the starter, a button near a cluster of switches. He had no idea if the fuel tanks were full or empty, no idea if the battery was dead, no idea if pressing that button would start the engine or blow him to pieces. But he was past the point of overthinking. He took a deep breath, whispered a prayer to a god he wasn't sure he believed in anymore, and pressed the button. Nothing happened. His heart sank. He tried again, holding it longer this time. Still nothing. Panic started to creep in. Maybe the tank was dead after all. Maybe this entire insane plan was doomed from the start. Then he noticed another lever near the floor, partially hidden in shadow. It looked like it might be connected to the fuel system. He pulled it, heard a faint clicking sound somewhere deep in the tank's mechanical guts, and tried the starter button again. This time, the engine coughed. It was a wet, choking sound, like something ancient waking from a long sleep. He pressed the button again, and the engine coughed harder, sputtered, and then, impossibly, roared to life. The sound was deafening inside the metal coffin of the driver's compartment. The entire tank vibrated with raw mechanical power, 700 horses worth of Maybach engines screaming beneath him. Günter couldn't believe it. The Panther was alive. He'd actually done it. He'd started a Nazi war machine with no training, no manual, and no business being anywhere near it. For a moment he just sat there, hands gripping the controls, feeling the vibration in his bones, trying to convince himself this was really happening. Now came the hard part, figuring out how to drive it. He'd watched tanks move through his town during the war, had seen how they pivoted and turned, but watching and doing were entirely different things. The steering mechanism worked by controlling the treads independently. Pull the left handlebar to turn left, pull the right to turn right, pull both to go forward. At least, that's what he thought. There was only one way to find out. He released what he hoped was the brake, a heavy lever near his right leg, and gently pulled back on both handlebars. The Panther lurched forward with shocking violence, nearly throwing him out of the seat. He overcorrected, yanked the controls too hard, and the tank veered wildly to the left, treads chewing up the ground and spitting out rocks and dirt. He was doing it. He was actually driving a Panther tank. It was terrifying and exhilarating and completely out of control, but he was moving, and now there was no turning back. The first few minutes of driving the Panther were pure chaos. Günter wrestled with the controls like he was trying to tame a wild animal, and in a sense he was. The tank didn't glide or roll, it lurched and bucked, its 30 tons of steel responding to every input with brutal, unforgiving force. He overcorrected constantly, swinging the nose left and right, the treads grinding and squealing against the earth. Twice he nearly crashed into the remnants of bombed-out buildings. Once he clipped a stone wall and felt the entire tank shudder, but the Panther barely noticed. It just kept moving, unstoppable, indifferent to obstacles that would have destroyed a car. Slowly, painfully, Günter started to understand the rhythm of it. Gentle pressure on the handlebars. Anticipate the delay between input and response. Don't fight the machine. Guide it. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes, he managed to get the Panther moving in something resembling a straight line. His destination was clear, the center of town, where the SS had set up their command post in the old municipal building. He had no plan beyond getting there, no strategy for what he'd do when he arrived. He just knew that he had to make them pay. As the Panther rumbled toward the town, Günter became aware of how exposed he was. The driver's compartment had a narrow vision slit, a horizontal opening maybe 6 inches wide, which gave him a tunneled, restricted view of the world. He could see directly ahead, but anything to the sides or above was invisible. He was encased in armor, yes, but also trapped in a steel box with almost no awareness of his surroundings. For all he knew, SS soldiers could be running alongside the tank right now, preparing to climb on and kill him. The thought made his skin crawl, but there was nothing he could do about it. He had to trust the armor, trust that the Panther's reputation would make people think twice before getting close. The engine noise was so loud that it drowned out everything else. He couldn't hear if anyone was shouting, couldn't hear if shots were being fired. He existed in a bubble of mechanical thunder, alone with his fear and his determination, driving a stolen war machine toward the heart of enemy territory. The town came into view through the vision slit, and Günter's breath caught in his chest. Smoke rose from a dozen fires. Streets were cratered from artillery strikes. And in the central square he could see figures moving, SS soldiers, maybe a dozen of them, milling around their command post. They hadn't noticed him yet. The Panther was coming from an unexpected direction, and the engine noise, while deafening to Günter, probably blended into the general chaos of war that filled the air. He had the element of surprise, but only for a few more seconds. His mind raced. What was he supposed to do when he got there? Ram the building, fire the cannon? He had no idea how to aim or load the main gun, and even if he did, he was alone in the tank with no crew to help. Then he remembered something. Tanks didn't just have main guns, they had machine guns too. The Panther had a hull-mounted machine gun right in front of the driver's position, operated by a trigger near the steering controls. If he could get close enough, if he could catch them off guard, maybe he could use it. Günter pressed harder on the controls, urging the Panther to move faster. The tank responded, picking up speed, treads clawing at the broken pavement as it barreled toward the square. 30 tons of German engineering designed to crush Soviet positions now aimed at the SS. The irony wasn't lost on him, but there was no time to appreciate it. He was committed now. The Panther was too loud, too visible, too unstoppable to turn back. Through the vision slit, he saw the moment the SS soldiers noticed him. They turned, confused at first, probably assuming it was one of their own tanks repositioning. Then confusion turned to alarm as they realized the Panther was accelerating directly toward them. They scattered, some diving for cover, others reaching for weapons. One officer, dressed in the black uniform with silver insignia, stood his ground and started shouting orders, trying to organize a response. That officer, Günter decided, would be the first target. He wasn't thinking clearly anymore, wasn't thinking about consequences or survival. He was running on pure adrenaline and righteous fury, the fury of a boy who'd watched his town terrorized, who'd seen innocent men executed, who'd had enough. The Panther crashed through a wooden barricade like it was made of paper. Splinters exploded in all directions. Günter's hands found the machine gun trigger and he squeezed. The weapon roared to life, spitting bullets in a horizontal line across the square. He had no training, no skill, but at this range, with this many targets, skill didn't matter. The SS soldiers who'd been standing in the open went down, some hit, others diving desperately for cover. The officer who'd been shouting orders disappeared behind a wall. Chaos erupted. The SS, so used to being the predators, were now the prey, and they didn't know how to handle it. Günter kept his finger on the trigger, kept the Panther moving forward, and for the first time since the executions in the square, he felt something other than helplessness. He felt powerful, and that feeling, terrifying and intoxicating in equal measure, pushed him forward into the heart of the battle he'd started. The SS command post erupted into pandemonium. Soldiers who moments earlier had been the undisputed masters of the town were now scrambling like ants whose nest had been kicked over. Some fired rifles at the Panther in pure panic, the bullets pinging harmlessly off the thick armor like rain on a tin roof. Others sprinted for the municipal building, trying to reach heavier weapons or simply to get out of the line of fire. A few stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. This was their tank. This was a German weapon. Who in their right mind would be using it against them? Through the narrow vision slit, Günter saw their confusion, their fear, and something dark and vengeful surged inside him. These were the men who had hanged his neighbors. These were the monsters who had turned his hometown into a prison. Now they were the ones running. Now they were the ones who knew what it felt like to be powerless. He swung the Panther's nose toward a cluster of soldiers, taking cover behind an overturned truck, and unleashed another burst from the machine gun. The noise inside the tank was absolutely hellish, a constant hammering that made his ears ring and his head pound, but he kept firing. The problem was that Günter had no real combat training and no understanding of tactics. He was operating purely on instinct and anger, which made him dangerous but also reckless. He didn't realize that while the Panther's frontal armor was nearly impenetrable, its sides and rear were more vulnerable. He didn't know how to use cover or concealment. He just drove forward in a straight line, firing at anything that moved, and that kind of aggression, while shocking at first, gave the SS time to regroup. Within 2 minutes of the attack starting, the SS officer who'd taken cover reappeared on a second-story balcony of the municipal building. He was carrying a Panzerfaust, a German anti-tank weapon that could punch through armor at close range. The officer took aim, but his hands were shaking. He'd never expected to use this weapon against his own equipment, and the absurdity of the situation threw off his timing. He fired, and the rocket-propelled grenade streaked past the Panther's turret, missing by several feet before exploding harmlessly against a wall behind the tank. Günter didn't even see it. He was too focused on the soldiers in front of him, too locked into the narrow tunnel vision of the driver's slit. But the near miss with the Panzerfaust changed everything. The SS now understood that they were under attack from one of their own tanks, which meant someone had stolen it, and whoever that someone was, they were inside that steel coffin right now. The officer on the balcony started screaming orders, and the SS soldiers began to coordinate. 3 of them broke away from the main group and started circling around to the Panther's left side, moving quickly through the rubble and smoke. Their plan was simple: get close enough to climb on the tank, pry open the hatches, and kill whoever was inside. Günter had no idea this was happening. His entire world was the 6-inch slit in front of him and the machine gun trigger under his finger. He was so focused on the threat directly ahead that he'd completely forgotten about the threat from the sides. It was the mistake of an amateur, and it was about to cost him everything. The 3 SS soldiers reached the Panther and began climbing onto the hull, their boots scraping against the metal. Günter felt the vibration through the tank's frame, and his blood turned to ice. Someone was on top of the Panther. He could hear them now, even over the engine noise, the sound of boots on metal, the sound of hands banging on the turret hatch. They were trying to get in. Panic seized him. He was trapped. If they opened that hatch, he was dead. They'd shoot him like a rat in a barrel or drag him out and beat him to death in the street. His hands jerked on the controls, and the Panther lurched violently to the left. The sudden movement threw one of the SS soldiers off the tank. The man hit the ground hard and didn't get up. But 2 more were still on top, and they'd reached the commander's cupola, the hatch Günter had climbed through to get inside. He could hear them working the latch, trying to force it open. His mind raced. He had seconds at best. Then he remembered, tanks could spin. If he pulled one handlebar and pushed the other, the Panther would pivot in place. He yanked the right handlebar back and shoved the left one forward with all his strength. The Panther rotated like a top, its treads churning in opposite directions. The entire 30-ton machine spinning with shocking speed. The centrifugal force was immense. Inside the driver's compartment, Günter was slammed against the side of the hull, his vision blurring. But outside, the effect on the SS soldiers was catastrophic. They lost their grip immediately, flung off the tank like riders thrown from a mechanical bull. One man crashed into a stone wall with a sickening crunch. The other tumbled across the pavement, rolling several times before coming to a stop in a heap. Günter stopped the spin, gasping for air, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst. He'd survived. Barely. But now the SS knew exactly what they were dealing with, and they weren't going to make the mistake of underestimating him again. The real battle was just beginning. The town square had become a war zone within a war, a pocket of insanity where the rules of the larger conflict no longer applied. Günter sat in the driver's compartment of the Panther, chest heaving, trying to catch his breath and process what had just happened. He'd thrown SS soldiers off the tank like rag dolls. He'd survived an attempt to be dragged out and executed. But survival didn't mean victory, and he was quickly realizing that his position was deteriorating. The SS were no longer panicking. They were adapting. Through the vision slit, he could see them repositioning, using the ruined buildings as cover, moving with the practiced efficiency of soldiers who'd fought on every front of the war. They knew he was alone in the tank. They knew he was inexperienced. And most importantly, they knew that if they could coordinate their attacks from multiple directions, they could overwhelm him. The officer on the balcony had retrieved another Panzerfaust and was taking careful aim. Other soldiers were flanking again, this time more cautiously, using smoke from the fires to mask their movement. Günter knew he couldn't stay stationary. A stationary tank was a dead tank, especially when the enemy had anti-tank weapons. He needed to keep moving, keep them guessing. But the problem was that every time he moved, he was gambling. The streets were narrow and filled with debris. One wrong turn and he could get stuck, wedged between buildings with no way to reverse out. And he was exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried him this far was starting to fade, replaced by a bone-deep fatigue that made his hands tremble on the controls. His ears were ringing from the machine gun fire. His throat was raw from breathing the acrid smoke that had seeped into the tank. But he couldn't stop. The moment he stopped, the moment he hesitated, they would kill him. So he did the only thing he could think of. He went on the offensive again. He gunned the engine and drove the Panther straight at the municipal building, the SS headquarters itself. If he was going to die, he'd make it count. The Panther smashed through the front entrance of the building like it was made of cardboard. The stone facade crumbled, wooden supports splintered and collapsed. The entire front wall came down in an avalanche of brick and dust, and the tank kept going, plowing into what had been the main hall. The noise was apocalyptic, a grinding, crashing symphony of destruction. Inside, SS soldiers who'd been using the building for cover scattered in terror as tons of masonry rained down on them. Günter couldn't see much through the dust cloud that now filled his vision slit, but he could feel the impacts, the vibrations of things breaking and collapsing around him. The Panther's treads chewed through furniture, floorboards, anything in their path. For a moment, Günter felt a wild surge of triumph. He'd just driven a tank through the SS command post. He'd literally demolished their seat of power. But the triumph was short-lived because now he had a new problem. He was stuck inside a partially collapsed building with limited visibility and no clear way out. The dust began to settle, and through the murk, Günter could make out shapes moving. SS soldiers were regrouping outside the ruined building, and they'd learned their lesson about getting too close. Instead, they were setting up a perimeter, trapping him inside. He tried to reverse the Panther, but the treads spun uselessly. Something was caught underneath, probably debris from the collapse. He was immobilized. Panic clawed at him again. This was it. He'd driven himself into a trap. The SS would surround the building, wait him out, and eventually He'd have to surrender or die inside the tank. But then he heard something that changed everything. The distant rumble of different engines. Heavier engines. American engines. The sound of Sherman tanks approaching from the west. The Americans had arrived. They'd been advancing all morning, and the sound of combat in the town square had drawn them in. The SS officer outside heard it too, and Günter saw through the vision slit the moment the man's face changed from determination to fear. The SS were about to be caught between an American armored column and a stolen Panther tank operated by a vengeful teenager. The SS did what they always did when faced with overwhelming force. They ran. Not in an organized retreat, but in pure, panicked flight. They abandoned their positions, dropped their weapons, and scattered into the side streets and alleys, desperate to escape before the Americans arrived. Within minutes, the square that had been a battleground was empty, except for the wreckage and the Panther. Günter sat in the driver's compartment, still trapped in the rubble of the collapsed building, and listened as the American tanks rolled into town. He heard voices shouting in English, heard the squeak of treads and the growl of Sherman engines, and then he heard something that made his heart stop, an American voice, amplified through a loudspeaker, demanding in broken German that whoever was inside the Panther come out with their hands up. They thought he was SS, they thought he was the enemy. Günter realized that after surviving the Nazis, he was about to be killed by his liberators, unless he could find a way to explain very quickly that he was just a 15-year-old kid who'd stolen a tank. Günter's hands were shaking so badly he could barely open the hatch. He'd survived the SS, survived driving a 30-ton war machine with no training, survived crashing through a building, and now he was about to be killed by American soldiers who had every reason to think he was a Nazi tanker making a last stand. The loudspeaker voice shouted again, this time more aggressive, the tone making it clear that if whoever was inside the Panther didn't surrender immediately, the Americans would open fire. Günter knew what a 75mm Sherman shell would do to even a Panther at close range. The frontal armor might hold, but he was stuck at an angle, partially buried in rubble, exposing his thinner side armor. One good shot and he'd be incinerated. His fingers finally found the hatch release and he pushed it open, fresh air and daylight flooding into the smoke-filled compartment. He pulled himself up through the commander's cupola, emerging into the sunlight with his hands raised high above his head, and the first thing he saw was 5 Sherman tanks arranged in a semicircle around the collapsed building, their main guns pointed directly at him. Behind the Shermans, American infantry had taken up firing positions, rifles aimed at the Panther. Günter could see their faces, hard and suspicious, fingers on triggers. These were men who'd been fighting their way across Europe for months, who'd seen too many friends die, who had no patience for tricks or traps. To them, he wasn't a liberator. He was just another German in a German tank. And the fact that he looked young didn't mean much in a war where the Hitler Youth had been throwing grenades at Allied soldiers. Günter stood on top of the Panther, hands still raised, and shouted the only English words he knew, "No shoot, no shoot!" His voice cracked with fear and exhaustion. One of the American soldiers, a sergeant based on his stripes, stepped forward cautiously and yelled something Günter didn't understand. Günter tried again, switching to German, words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "I'm not SS, I'm not a soldier. I stole the tank. I'm just trying to help." He had no idea if they understood him, but he kept talking, kept his hands raised, kept praying they wouldn't fire. The sergeant barked an order, and 2 soldiers approached the Panther with their rifles raised, moving carefully as if expecting an ambush. When they got close enough to see Günter clearly, their expressions changed from hostility to confusion. He was obviously a kid, skinny, covered in grime and oil, wearing civilian clothes that were too big for him. One of the soldiers, younger than the others, lowered his rifle slightly and said something to the sergeant. The sergeant shouted at Günter to climb down from the tank, using hand gestures to make his meaning clear. Günter's legs nearly gave out as he descended. He'd been running on adrenaline for so long that now, faced with the prospect of actual safety, his body was shutting down. He half climbed, half fell off the Panther and collapsed onto the rubble-strewn ground. The American soldiers surrounded him immediately, rifles still trained on him, but their posture had shifted from combat-ready to merely cautious. The sergeant knelt down next to Günter and started asking questions in slow, simple German that he'd probably learned from a phrase book. What followed was the strangest interrogation of Günter's life. Sitting in the ruins of the SS command post, surrounded by American soldiers, he tried to explain what he'd done. The words came out jumbled and incoherent at first. He told them about the executions in the square, about stealing the tank, about attacking the SS. The Americans listened with expressions that ranged from disbelief to amazement. The sergeant kept interrupting to ask clarifying questions, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. At one point, he called over an officer, a lieutenant who spoke better German, and Günter had to tell the whole story again. The lieutenant's eyes widened when Günter described driving the Panther through the building. He looked at the destroyed municipal hall, then back at Günter, then at the Panther still half buried in rubble, and he actually laughed. Not a mocking laugh, but a laugh of pure astonishment. He turned to his men and said something in English that made several of them shake their heads in wonder. One soldier offered Günter a canteen of water and a piece of chocolate, and that small act of kindness after everything he'd been through almost made him break down and cry. The Americans secured the area quickly and efficiently. Patrols were sent out to hunt down the fleeing SS soldiers. Medics arrived to treat the wounded, both German civilians who'd been caught in the crossfire and a few SS soldiers who'd been too injured to escape. The Panther was examined by American tank crews who couldn't believe a 15-year-old had managed to start it, much less drive it into combat. They poked around inside, checking the fuel gauge, the ammunition stores, marveling at how Günter had operated a machine that normally required a crew of 5. One of the American tankers, a grizzled veteran with sergeant stripes, clapped Günter on the shoulder and said something that the interpreter translated as, "Kid, you've got bigger balls than most of the men I serve with." It was crude, but it was also the highest compliment a soldier could give, and Günter felt something loosen in his chest. He'd done it. Against all odds, against all reason, he'd actually done it. He'd fought back. And he'd survived. Word of what Günter had done spread through the American ranks like wildfire. Soldiers who'd been fighting their way through Germany for months, who'd seen horrors that would haunt them for the rest of their lives, suddenly had a story that felt like something out of a movie. A 15-year-old kid had stolen a Panther tank and used it to attack the SS. The sheer audacity of it was almost incomprehensible. By the end of the day, officers from the battalion headquarters arrived to interview Günter themselves. A military intelligence officer, a captain who spoke fluent German, sat down with him in what remained of the town's schoolhouse and took his statement in meticulous detail. Where exactly had he found the tank? How had he started it? What had he been thinking when he drove it into the SS command post? The captain wrote everything down, occasionally shaking his head in disbelief, and when the interview was over, he told Günter something that would stay with him forever. "You're either the bravest kid I've ever met, or the craziest, probably both." Then he added more seriously, "What you did saved lives. Those SS bastards were planning to fight to the last man and take as many civilians with them as they could. You disrupted that. You gave us an opening. People are alive today because of you." But not everyone in Günter's town saw him as a hero. In the days immediately following the liberation, as the Americans established military governance and the townspeople emerged from hiding, Günter discovered that his actions had created a complicated legacy. Some people thanked him, some called him brave, but others, particularly those who'd been loyal to the Nazi regime or who feared being associated with any act of resistance, looked at him with suspicion or outright hostility. There were whispers that he'd brought unnecessary violence to the town, that the Americans would have liberated them peacefully if he hadn't provoked the SS. A few accused him of being a traitor to Germany, even though Germany itself was collapsing and the war was clearly lost. Günter found himself caught in a strange limbo, celebrated by the occupying forces, but viewed with mixed feelings by his own community. His father, who'd always taught him to think for himself, embraced him and told him he was proud. His mother wept and held him and told him never to do anything that stupid again. And Günter, exhausted and traumatized, simply tried to process what had happened. The Americans wanted to use Günter's story for propaganda purposes. They saw the value in it. A German teenager turning against the SS, using their own weapon against them. It was a perfect narrative to show that not all Germans were Nazis, that resistance was possible even from within. They took photographs of Günter standing next to the Panther, which had been extracted from the rubble and was now a curiosity piece for American soldiers, who posed with it like hunters with a trophy. Reporters from American military newspapers interviewed him. Plans were made to write up his story for publication back in the States, but Günter resisted. He didn't want to be a symbol or a propaganda tool. He didn't want his face plastered across newspapers. He just wanted to be a kid again, to try to forget the things he'd seen and done. Eventually, the Americans respected his wishes, and the story remained mostly confined to military channels, known among soldiers, but never achieving the wide publicity it might have otherwise received. As spring turned to summer, and Germany officially surrendered in May of 1945, Günter tried to rebuild some semblance of a normal life. The town was gradually reconstructed. The American occupation forces maintained order and began the process of denazification, rooting out former SS members and party officials. Günter testified at several tribunals, identifying SS officers who'd participated in the executions he'd witnessed. Some of those men were prosecuted, others disappeared into the chaos of post-war Europe, their fates unknown. The Panther tank itself was eventually shipped to the United States as a war trophy, ending up in a military museum where it still sits today, though most visitors have no idea of the extraordinary story attached to it. And Günter, the boy who'd driven it into battle, faded into obscurity. He never sought recognition, never wrote a memoir, never gave interviews once the war was over. He simply went back to being a civilian, carrying the weight of what he'd done in silence. Over the decades that followed, Günter's story became something of an urban legend among World War II historians. There were references to it in obscure military reports, in the memoirs of American soldiers who'd been there, in scattered documents from the occupation period. But without Günter himself speaking publicly about it, the details remained fuzzy, the facts mixed with myth. Some versions claimed he'd destroyed multiple SS vehicles. Others said he'd killed dozens of soldiers. Some even suggested the whole thing was exaggerated or fabricated. The truth, as it often is, was simultaneously more modest and more extraordinary than the legends. Günter Halm really had stolen a Panther tank. He really had driven it, alone and untrained, into combat against the SS. He really had survived. And then, instead of becoming famous, he'd chosen to disappear into history, content to let the story fade, rather than spend his life reliving his 15-year-old self's moment of desperate courage. The immediate aftermath of Günter's attack on the SS command post had consequences that rippled through the town in ways he never anticipated. In the hours after the Americans secured the area, they discovered something chilling in the ruins of the municipal building. Documents outlining the SS plan for the town's defense, which was really a plan for its destruction. The officers had intended to use the civilian population as human shields to booby-trap buildings, to fight block by block until nothing remained standing. They'd written orders to execute anyone who displayed white flags or attempted to surrender to the Americans. The town wasn't going to be liberated, it was going to be turned into a cemetery. When the American intelligence officers showed these documents to Günter through their interpreter, he felt sick. He'd acted out of anger and desperation, not strategic thinking, but his reckless assault had inadvertently disrupted the SS's entire plan. The chaos he'd created, the officers he'd scattered, the command post he'd demolished, all of it had prevented a massacre. The captain who'd interviewed him hadn't been exaggerating. Günter really had saved lives, possibly hundreds of them, including his own families. But survival came with a price, and for Günter that price was psychological. In the weeks following the incident, he began having nightmares. He'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, hearing the sound of the Panther's engine in his head, feeling the vibration of the machine gun in his hands. He saw the faces of the SS soldiers he'd shot, saw them falling, and even though they'd been monsters who'd murdered innocent people, even though he'd had every reason to fight back, the act of killing haunted him. He was 15 years old. He should have been worrying about school, about friends, about normal teenage concerns. Instead, he'd taken lives, and that knowledge sat inside him like a stone. His father tried to help, talking to him late into the night, reminding him that he'd done what was necessary, that those men would have killed him and countless others without hesitation. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally are two different things. Günter struggled, and there was no such thing as therapy or trauma counseling in post-war Germany. You just lived with it and tried to move forward. The town itself became a strange place in the months that followed. The Americans were generally decent occupiers, more interested in rebuilding than punishing, but the process of denazification created tensions. People who'd been enthusiastic party members suddenly claimed they'd never really believed in it. Opportunists who'd profited from the regime tried to reinvent themselves as victims, and genuine victims, like the families of the men the SS had executed, demanded justice that was often slow in coming or never arrived at all. Günter found himself in an odd position. Some townspeople treated him like a hero, crediting him with hastening the liberation. Others avoided him, either out of shame that a child had been braver than they had, or because association with him felt dangerous in the uncertain new order. A few, particularly older men who'd been in the Nazi Party, openly resented him. One confronted him in the street, calling him a traitor, saying he'd dishonored Germany by attacking his own countrymen. Günter, still processing his trauma, didn't have the energy to argue. He simply walked away, though the words stung. As summer turned to autumn in 1945, Günter made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He decided to let the story go. The Americans had lost interest now that the war was over, and reconstruction was the priority. The reporters had moved on to other stories. And Günter himself wanted nothing more than to be invisible. He stopped talking about what had happened. When people asked, he gave vague answers and changed the subject. He threw himself into helping rebuild the town, working on construction crews despite his age, trying to lose himself in physical labor. His father understood and supported the decision. His mother was relieved, hoping that silence might help him heal. And gradually, as the months turned into years, the story of the boy who stole a Panther tank became something people in the town rarely mentioned, a war memory filed away alongside countless others in a country trying desperately to forget. Günter never sought recognition for what he'd done, never contacted historians or journalists, never tried to verify or correct the various accounts that circulated in military circles. He finished his education, learned a trade, got married, had children, and lived a quiet, unremarkable life in post-war Germany. When his children asked about the war, he told them the basics, nothing more. He didn't tell them about the Panther until they were adults, and even then he framed it simply. He'd done what needed to be done and he'd survived, that was all. He discouraged them from making a big deal out of it. He refused interviews from the few historians who managed to track him down decades later. He wanted to be remembered as a father, a craftsman, a neighbor, not as the kid who'd stolen a tank. And for the most part, he got his wish. He died in 2003 at the age of 73, surrounded by family, and his obituary in the local paper made no mention of the Panther or the SS or that desperate day in April of 1945. But stories like Günter's have a way of refusing to stay buried forever. Military historians kept digging. American veterans who'd been there wrote their memoirs and mentioned the incident. Documents were declassified, and slowly, piece by piece, the full story began to emerge from the shadows of history. The Panther tank he'd driven, still sitting in an American military museum, was eventually identified and its history traced back to that small German town and the 15-year-old boy who'd used it as a weapon of liberation. Researchers found the photographs the Americans had taken, found the intelligence reports, found the testimonies from the townspeople, and what they discovered was a story so extraordinary, so improbable, that it seemed almost like fiction. But it wasn't fiction. It was real. Every bit of it. And now, decades after Günter Halm decided to fade into obscurity, his story is finally being told the way it deserves to be told, as one of the most remarkable acts of courage and defiance in the final days of World War II. So why does Günter Halm's story matter today, 8 decades after he climbed into that Panther tank and changed the course of his town's fate? because it challenges everything we think we know about heroism, about resistance, and about who gets remembered in the grand narrative of history. We remember the generals, the politicians, the famous soldiers whose names are etched into monuments and taught in schools. We remember D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge and the liberation of concentration camps. But we forget the smaller moments, the individual acts of courage that didn't change the outcome of the war, but changed everything for the people who experienced them. Günter Halm didn't defeat Nazi Germany. He didn't liberate Europe. He just saved his town from a final, pointless bloodbath carried out by fanatics who refused to accept that they'd lost. And in doing so, he proved something profound, that even in the darkest moments of history, even when evil seems overwhelming and unstoppable, one person, even a child, can make a difference. The story also reveals something uncomfortable about how we remember World War II, particularly in the West. We like our narratives clean and simple. The Allies were heroes, the Nazis were villains, and the German people were either complicit or passive victims. But Günter's story doesn't fit that framework. He was German. He grew up in the Hitler Youth. By the logic of simplified history, he should have been the enemy, but instead he risked his life to fight against the SS, to protect his neighbors, to stop the senseless killing. His story reminds us that resistance wasn't just about organized partisan groups or dramatic assassination attempts. Sometimes it was a kid who'd simply had enough, who saw an opportunity and took it without thinking about glory or recognition. And the fact that we almost forgot him entirely, that his story survived mostly by accident in obscure military records, says something troubling about whose courage we choose to celebrate and whose we allow to slip into oblivion. There's also a technical aspect to Günter's story that deserves recognition. What he did was, from a purely mechanical standpoint, nearly impossible. Modern tankers who've studied the Panther's systems are astonished that a 15-year-old with no training managed to start the engine, much less drive it in combat conditions. The Panther was notoriously complex, prone to mechanical failure, difficult to operate even for experienced crews. The fact that Günter figured it out through observation and desperation, that he kept the machine running long enough to accomplish his mission, speaks to a kind of genius born of necessity. He had no manual, no instructor, no second chances. He just had his wits and his determination, and somehow impossibly that was enough. Tank crews who've heard his story talk about it with a mixture of admiration and disbelief, because they understand exactly how many things could have gone wrong, how many ways he should have failed, and they're amazed that he didn't. But perhaps the most important lesson from Günter's story is about the cost of silence. He chose not to tell his story, and that choice is understandable and even admirable in its humility. He didn't want fame. He didn't want to be defined by the worst day of his life. He wanted to move forward and be normal. But in his silence, a piece of history almost disappeared. Future generations almost lost the knowledge that this happened, that this kind of courage existed, that resistance was possible even in the most hopeless circumstances. And that's a loss, because stories like Günter's are exactly what we need today. Not to glorify war or violence, but to remind ourselves that ordinary people, when pushed to the breaking point, are capable of extraordinary things. That evil can be fought even when the odds are overwhelming. That youth is not synonymous with powerlessness. That the choices we make in moments of crisis define who we are. Today, the Panther tank Günter drove sits in a climate-controlled museum in the United States, meticulously preserved, its armor still bearing the scars of battle. Tourists walk past it, take photographs, read the placard that describes it as a German Panther tank, captured April 1945. Most of them have no idea that this particular machine was stolen by a teenager and driven into combat against the SS. The story isn't on the placard. It's not part of the official display. And that's a shame, because this tank isn't just a piece of military hardware. It's a monument to defiance, to the moment when one boy decided that he'd rather die fighting than live in a world where monsters went unchallenged. Some historians have petitioned the museum to update the display, to include Günter's story, to give him the recognition he never sought in life. Whether that happens remains to be seen. But whether his name appears on a museum wall or not, his story is now out there, preserved in the digital age, ready to inspire anyone who needs to be reminded that courage doesn't require an army. Sometimes it just requires one person, one moment and one impossible decision. Günter Halm died believing his story didn't matter, that it was just one small incident in a war filled with millions of incidents. But he was wrong. His story matters precisely because it's small, because it's human, because it shows us that heroism isn't reserved for soldiers and generals and people whose names we already know. It's available to anyone brave enough or desperate enough or angry enough to stand up when standing up seems impossible. The 15-year-old boy who stole a Panther tank and drove it into the heart of darkness didn't change the war. But he changed his town. He changed the lives of everyone who would have died in the SS's final stand. And now, finally, his story has the chance to change how we think about courage, about resistance, and about the power of one person to push back against the machinery of evil. That's why we remember Günter Halm, not because he was a hero in the traditional sense, but because he reminds us that when everything seems lost, when the monsters are in control and hope is gone, there's still one option left. Fight back. Even if you're just a kid. Even if you have no idea what you're doing. Even if the odds of survival are almost zero, fight back. Because sometimes, against all logic and probability, you might just win. And even if you don't, at least you'll have tried. At least you'll have refused to go quietly. At least you'll have shown the world that some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight seems hopeless. That's Günter Halm's legacy. That's the story they almost forgot. And that's why it needed to be told.